Blood has a smell they don't warn you about in nursing school. It's heavy like wet pennies left in a hot car. But the men standing at the clinic's back exit weren't bleeding. They were completely pristine. And that, more than anything, is what made my stomach drop. Scrubbing out for the last time felt less like a victory and more like scrubbing a crime scene. The harsh granular borax soap ground into the cracks of my knuckles, stinging the micro-cuts I'd accumulated over 12 hours of starting IVs and wrestling belligerent drunks. I stood at the sink in the staff locker room, watching the water turn a faint murky pink remnants of a motorcycle accident from room 3 before swirling down the rusted aluminum drain. 12 years. 12 years of graveyard shifts in this decaying concrete box on the edge of the Oregon coast. Tonight was it. I was done. I dried my hands on a stiff brown paper towel, the kind that merely pushes the moisture around rather than absorbing it. The fluorescent light above the sink flickered, emitting a low, angry buzz that had been vibrating in my molars since 8 p.m. I threw the towel into a plastic bin overflowing with discarded gloves and surgical masks. My locker number 42 protested with a metallic screech when I pulled it open. Inside hung my civilian clothes, a faded gray hoodie jeans, and a pair of beat-up boots. I stripped off my scrubs. They were stiff with dried betadine, and God knows what else. I didn't fold them. I shoved them into a plastic grocery bag and tied it in a hard knot. I was exhausted, not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep fixes, but a deep cellular fatigue. My arches throbbed. The cheap stethoscope around my neck had left a permanent red indentation against my skin. I tossed it into the locker and slammed the door shut. The echo snapped down the empty hallway. Clocking out felt profoundly anticlimactic. The time machine stamped my card with a wet thunk. 6:14 a.m. The emergency room was quiet as I took the back hallway toward the loading dock. It was a route meant for linen deliveries and biohazard disposal, but it bypassed the waiting room where a man was currently screaming at the triage nurse about a refill for oxycodone. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to see the peeling linoleum, the tired faces of the night staff, or the sterile white walls anymore. I pushed open the heavy steel fire door. The damp, frigid coastal air hit me like a physical blow. It smelled of low-tide rotting kelp and the distant sulphurous belch of the paper mill down the highway. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing fog fill my lungs. It was still dark out, the sun, a mere suggestion of gray behind the thick cloud cover. My car, a 2011 Honda with a cracked windshield and a passenger door that didn't open from the inside, sat alone under the single buzzing sodium lamp at the far end of the employee lot. I shoved my hands into my hoodie pockets, fishing for my keys. My fingers brushed against a crushed pack of cigarettes I hadn't touched in 3 months. I pulled it out, stared at the single bent cylinder left inside, and put it between my lips. I didn't have a lighter. I paused under the overhang of the loading dock, patting my pockets in a futile search for a stray matchbook. That was when I noticed the silence. The usual morning sounds, the distant rumble of Highway 101. The clatter of the garbage trucks were gone. The air felt unnaturally dense, heavy, with a strange static pressure. I looked up. 3 vehicles were parked in a tight herringbone formation, completely blocking the exit of the loading dock driveway. They were matte black SUVs, their engines idling so quietly I could barely hear the hum. No headlights, no running lights, just dark, massive shapes blending into the coastal fog. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. Muggers didn't drive armored Suburbans. Cops didn't park like a barricade without their flashers on. A heavy metallic clack echoed to my left. I turned the unlit cigarette slipping from my lips and bouncing off the damp asphalt. 4 men stood in the shadows of the concrete loading ramp. I hadn't heard them approach. I hadn't heard a single footstep, a scuff of a boot, or the rustle of fabric. They were just suddenly there, materializing from the damp gray air. They were wearing bulky tactical gear plate carriers, heavily laden with magazines, radios, and pouches. Helmets with quad-lens night vision goggles pushed up like insect eyes. Suppressed rifles hung slack against their chests on single-point slings. The gear was dark, mud-splattered around the knees and boots, but their posture was terrifyingly relaxed. I froze. My brain, wired by a decade of trauma nursing to assess and react, suddenly flatlined. Fight or flight evaporated. I was just prey caught in the open. One of them stepped forward. He was tall, his face obscured by a dark gaiter pulled up over his nose. His eyes, visible between the gaiter and the rim of his helmet, were a pale, washed-out blue. They weren't aggressive. They weren't angry. They were just overwhelmingly, suffocatingly focused. He stopped 6 feet away. The smell hit me. Then not blood, but cordite ozone, dried sweat, and the sharp chemical tang of gun oil. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was quiet. It barely carried over the hum of the idling SUVs, yet it demanded absolute immediate compliance. It wasn't a request. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly as dry as sandpaper. My keys slipped from my numb fingers, hitting the pavement with a sharp jingle. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, hating how small my voice sounded. "We need a trauma nurse," the man said, ignoring my question. He didn't raise his weapon. His hands remained resting lightly on the front of his vest. "Our corpsman is down. We have 3 minutes before our patient bleeds through his packing." "The ER is around the front," I stammered, pointing a shaking finger back toward the hospital. "Go through the double doors. Dr. Hayes is on call." "We are not going inside," the man interrupted. His tone didn't shift. It remained a flat, calm baritone. "You are coming with us." "I just clocked out," I said. It was an idiotic thing to say, a profoundly stupid bureaucratic response to heavily armed men in a dark parking lot. But my mind was clinging to the rules of a civilian world that was rapidly evaporating. "I'm off shift. I quit tonight. I'm not—" 2 of the other men moved. They didn't rush. They simply flanked me, stepping between my car and the loading dock. The lead man took off his gloves. His hands were large, calloused, and stained with something dark around the cuticles. "Ma'am," he repeated softer this time, "this is not a negotiation. You have the skills to keep him alive until exfil. Get in the vehicle." I didn't walk to the SUV. I was funneled. The operators didn't grab me, didn't shove me, but their physical presence was a wall closing in. I moved because standing still felt like standing in front of a slow-moving freight train. The heavy rear door of the middle Suburban swung open, revealing a cavernous, dark interior. "Get in," the lead operator said. I climbed up my cheap boots, slipping on the metal running board. My knee slammed hard into the door jamb, a sharp spike of pain shooting up my thigh, but I barely registered it. The adrenaline was finally hitting my bloodstream, turning my hands into vibrating, useless claws. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging the cabin into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint green glow of a laptop screen mounted between the front seats. The operator with the pale blue eyes climbed into the passenger seat. The driver, a hulking silhouette, threw the vehicle into gear. We moved, fast. There was no screeching of tires, no dramatic cinematic acceleration. Just a brutal pinning force, pushing me back into the leather seat as the heavy engine roared. We blew past the hospital parking lot, taking the back access road toward the dense pine forests that choked the hills above the town. I huddled in the back seat, my arms wrapped around my chest, shivering violently. The interior smelled intensely of men who had been running on pure adrenaline for days. It was a suffocating mix of sour body odor, damp wool, and the metallic tang of wet dirt. "Where are we going?" I asked. My teeth chattered so hard the words came out fractured. Nobody answered. "Listen to me." I tried again, my voice rising an octave in panic. I grabbed the metal mesh separating the front from the back. "I don't have gear. I have a half-empty roll of medical tape in my pocket and a pulse oximeter. If someone is bleeding out, I need a trauma bay. I need O-negative blood. I need suction. I need—" "You'll have what you need," the man in the passenger seat said, without turning around. "You don't understand," I shouted, the thin veneer of my professionalism cracking. "If he has a severed artery, I can't fix it with positive thoughts. I'm a nurse, not a fucking magician." "Quiet," the driver said. It wasn't a yell. It was a low growl heavy with authority. I clamped my mouth shut, tears of sheer frustration and terror pricking the corners of my eyes. I hated myself for crying. I hated the weakness of it. But the reality was sinking in. I wasn't at St. Jude's anymore. There was no security button under a desk to press. I was completely at the mercy of ghosts. The drive lasted exactly 8 minutes. We veered off the paved road onto a heavily rutted logging trail. The heavy SUV took the bumps with brutal stiffness, throwing me against the door panel. I tasted copper as my teeth clipped my inner lip. We slammed to a halt inside what looked like an abandoned lumber mill. The skeletal remains of corrugated tin roofs loomed in the fog. Before the vehicle even settled on its suspension, the doors flew open. "Out," the lead operator commanded. I scrambled out, the cold air hitting my wet face. The other 2 SUVs had already arrived. Men were pulling a heavy black litter from the back of the lead vehicle. "Move," someone said, a hand firmly guiding the small of my back. They carried the litter into a rusted-out warehouse. Inside, chemical light sticks and a few battery-powered floodlights threw harsh, jagged shadows against the concrete floor. A heavy canvas tarp had been laid down. They dropped the litter in the center of the tarp. "Show me," I said. The panic was still there, a screaming animal in the back of my skull, but the sight of a body on a stretcher triggered 12 years of muscle memory. I dropped to my knees beside the litter. The patient was an operator. He was stripped of his plate carrier, his combat shirt cut open. He was terrifyingly pale, his skin gray and clammy in the harsh LED light. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. Mechanisms of injury. I snapped, looking up at the lead operator. My hands hovered over the man's chest, afraid to touch without knowing what I was looking at. "GSW," the lead man said. "Through and through the right deltoid patched. Shrapnel to the right thigh high up. Severed the femoral." The femoral, a death sentence in the field. "How long ago?" I demanded, ripping off my hoodie. The cold air bit my bare arms, but I didn't care. 20 minutes. "He should be dead," I muttered. "Our medic packed it with hemostatic gauze and clamped it before he took a round to the neck." The operator said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. I looked at the patient's thigh. A massive pressure dressing was soaked through a dark arterial crimson, welling up and spilling over the edges onto the canvas litter. "It's blowing through," I said. "He needs a tourniquet high and tight." "Already have one. It's not holding. The wound is too high in the groin crease. I need gloves. I need a light right here." I pointed to the man's hip. A heavy Pelican case was slammed down beside me. It popped open to reveal organized rows of trauma gear. Better gear than we had at the county hospital. I grabbed a pair of blue nitrile gloves, ripping one as I shoved my shaking hand into it. I grabbed another and snapped it on. An operator knelt opposite me, a high-lumen flashlight in his hand, illuminating the ruined flesh of the man's thigh. "Hold him down," I ordered. "When I pull this packing, it's going to spray. I need to find the bleeder and clamp it with a hemostat. Give me that tray." I grabbed a pair of heavy steel hemostatic forceps from the kit. My hands were shaking so violently they rattled against each other. I squeezed my eyes shut for a microsecond. "Breathe, Rachel. Just mechanics. It's just plumbing." "Ready?" I asked, looking at the man holding the light. He nodded once. I grabbed the edge of the blood-soaked dressing. It was thick and heavy. I ripped it away. Warm blood geysered upward in a thick rhythmic pulse, hitting me directly in the chest and splashing across my chin. It was hot and sticky. The coppery smell was overwhelming, mixing with the scent of voided bowels and sweat. The patient who had been unconscious suddenly arched his back, a guttural choked scream tearing from his throat. His massive, heavy hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with crushing force. "Hold him!" I screamed, panicking. The blood was flooding the wound cavity so fast I couldn't see the tissue. I was flying blind in a pool of red. Two operators threw their weight onto the man's chest and legs, pinning him to the metal frame of the litter. The man with the flashlight didn't flinch, keeping the beam focused directly on the pulsing crater in the thigh. I jammed my fingers into the wound. The flesh was hot, slippery, and ragged. The man screamed again, a terrible wet sound. "Sorry, sorry, sorry," I chanted, half crying. My fingers desperately sweeping the inside of the wound tract. I felt the pulse, a thick, vibrating hose of a vein. "Got it," I yelled. I pinched the artery between my index and middle finger, pressing it hard against the pelvic bone. The bleeding slowed to a dark, sluggish ooze. I was panting, sweat stinging my eyes. I looked down at my hand buried halfway to the wrist in a stranger's thigh. I looked up at the lead operator. He was watching me, his pale blue eyes calculating, unblinking. "Hemostat!" I gasped, holding my free hand out. "Now!" The heavy steel hemostat slapped into my waiting palm. It was freezing cold, the rigid metal biting into my skin through the thin nitrile glove. "Don't move him!" I hissed, my voice vibrating with a frantic feral energy I didn't recognize. I kept my left hand buried in the man's thigh, my index and middle fingers cramping violently as they crushed the severed femoral artery against the pale, unyielding ridge of his pelvic bone. The blood pooling in the crater of torn muscle was dark and hot, steaming faintly in the frigid air of the abandoned mill. I couldn't see the vessel. I had to do this entirely by feel. I slid the curved nose of the hemostat down the length of my own fingers, chasing the slick, pulsing hose of the artery. The operator beneath me groaned a low, wet sound that vibrated through the canvas litter. His massive thigh muscles spasmed, trying to jerk away from the agony. "Hold him!" I screamed again. The two men pinning him didn't flinch. They simply leaned harder, their body weight dropping into their knees, locking the wounded man to the floor. The tip of the forceps met the end of my fingers. I took a short, jagged breath, tasting copper and dust. I opened the jaws of the clamp, slid them blindly over the slick, vibrating tissue, and squeezed. Click, click, click. The ratcheted teeth of the hemostat locked into place. I slowly eased the pressure from my left hand, pulling my fingers back a fraction of an inch. I stared at the wound cavity, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The geyser had stopped. There was residual bleeding, a sluggish dark oozing from the collateral veins and torn muscle tissue, but the catastrophic life-ending arterial pump was dead. I slumped back on my heels, my lungs pulling in a massive, shuddering breath. My arms felt like they were filled with lead. I looked at my hands. They were painted crimson to the wrists. "It's clamped," I gasped, wiping my forehead with the back of my forearm and leaving a smear of someone else's blood across my skin. "But he's empty. Look at him. He's crashing." The wounded operator's skin had turned the color of wet cement. His lips were a bruised cyanotic blue. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks. He had lost too much volume. Clamping the leak didn't matter if there wasn't enough fluid left in the pipes to keep his brain oxygenated. He needs volume. Now, I said my professional programming overriding the sheer paralyzing terror of the situation. I looked up at the lead operator, the one with the pale blue eyes. "Do you have whole blood saline anything?" He was already moving. He knelt beside the Pelican case, his movements ruthlessly efficient. He pulled out a thick foil pouch and tossed it onto the canvas next to my knees. "O negative, low titer, chilled," the lead man said. "Push it." It was a field transfusion kit. I ripped the foil open with my bloody gloves. Inside was a heavy plastic bag of whole blood, a macro drip IV line, and a 14-gauge needle, a massive piece of steel meant for dumping fluid into a body as fast as physically possible. "I need a vein," I said, scanning the patient's thick, heavily tattooed arms. "Flashlight, here, in the crook of his arm." The man who had been holding the light shifted his position, snapping the blinding beam onto the patient's left antecubital space. Finding a vein on a healthy, hydrated man of this size would be a joke. You could probably hit one with a dart from across the room. But he wasn't healthy. He was in profound hypovolemic shock. His vascular system had clamped down, shrinking his veins into invisible thread-like wires in a desperate attempt to shunt whatever blood he had left to his core. I dragged my thumb across his skin, pressing hard, praying to feel the subtle, bouncy rebound of a vein. Nothing. It was like pressing into cold rubber. Come on, I muttered, panic creeping back into my throat. If I couldn't get a line in, he was going to die right here on this dirty tarp, and I was going to have to watch him do it. Can't get it, the lead operator asked. His voice was a flat, emotionless drone. It made me want to hit him. His veins are flat, I snapped. I need an IO, intraosseous drill. Do you have one? No, the lead man said. Find a vein. I am telling you they are collapsed. The lead operator stepped closer. He reached down and wrapped his massive calloused hand tightly around the wounded man's bicep, acting as a human tourniquet. Look higher, the basilic, find it. I hated him in that moment. I hated his calm. I hated his impossible expectations. But I leaned in my nose inches from the patient's skin and rubbed the area roughly with a coarse gauze pad, hoping the friction would cause a millimeter of vasodilation. A faint pale blue line materialized just beneath the surface of the skin. It was tiny. It was rolling. And I had a needle the size of a coffee straw. I didn't think. I just anchored the vein with my left thumb, angled the 14-gauge needle, and drove it through the skin. I felt a subtle pop. A dark flash of blood appeared in the plastic chamber of the needle hub. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding, sliding the plastic catheter forward and pulling the sharp steel stylet out. It held. Got it, I breathed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely twist the IV tubing onto the hub. I opened the roller clamp completely. "Squeeze the bag," I ordered the operator holding the blood. "Force it in. We don't have time for gravity." The man grabbed the blood bag in both hands and squeezed, forcing the thick red fluid down the tubing and into his teammate's arm. For the next 10 minutes, the abandoned mill was completely silent, save for the hum of the idling SUVs and the ragged, rattling breaths of the man on the floor. I knelt in the puddle of blood, my knees soaking through the denim of my jeans, keeping one hand wrapped around the hemostat, locked in his groin, and the other resting on his carotid artery, feeling for the pulse. It was thready. It felt like a butterfly trapped under his skin. But as the second bag of blood was forced into his arm, the fluttering stabilized. It grew heavier, slower. The gray hue of his skin began to recede, replaced by a pale, sickly pallor. It wasn't good, but it was survivable. "He's stabilizing," I whispered, mostly to myself. "Will the clamp hold during transit?" the lead operator asked. He was standing by the heavy metal doors of the mill, staring out into the dense fog-choked woods. I looked down at the heavy steel forceps jutting out of the ruined thigh. "If he thrashes around, it'll tear the artery completely. You have to keep him sedated and perfectly still." "Understood." The man holding the flashlight tapped his radio earpiece. He didn't speak, but he looked over at the lead operator and nodded once. 2 minutes, the lead man said. The change in the air happened before the sound arrived. The dense static fog inside the mill began to swirl, picking up decades of fine powdery sawdust and rust flakes from the concrete floor. The air pressure dropped, making my ears pop. Then came the vibration, a heavy rhythmic thumping that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my sternum. It wasn't a roar. It was a suppressed heavy beating of the air. "Pack it up," the lead operator said. The transition from a static medical scene to a mobile unit was violently fast. The operators didn't speak. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying efficiency. One man grabbed the empty blood bags and the medical trash, shoving them into a black trash bag. Another slammed the Pelican case shut. The 2 men who had been holding the patient grabbed the handles of the litter. "Wait!" I yelled over the increasing noise of the rotors. I was still holding the hemostat. "I can't let go of the clamp. It's not sutured, it's just clipped." The lead operator appeared beside me. He dropped to one knee. "I've got it," he said. "You can't jostle it," I warned, my voice cracking. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving me cold, hollow, and painfully aware of how small I was in this room full of giants. "I won't," he said. He reached down his large hand, gently but firmly, wrapping around the steel rings of the hemostat, replacing my grip. His skin was warm. "Let go, ma'am." I slowly peeled my fingers away. The clamp didn't shift. The bleeding didn't resume. I stumbled backward, falling onto my backside on the cold concrete. I scrambled away as the 2 operators lifted the heavy litter in a smooth, unified motion. The loading bay doors of the mill had been thrown open. Outside, the fog was being shredded by the downwash of a massive matte black helicopter that had seemingly materialized out of nowhere. It hovered 3 feet off the ground, its landing gear barely touching the overgrown weeds. There were no running lights, no markings. The operators moved in a tight diamond formation around the litter, jogging out into the violent wind of the rotor wash. I sat on the concrete, my arms wrapped around my knees, shielding my eyes from the flying debris. I watched them load the litter into the dark belly of the aircraft. In less than 30 seconds, they were all aboard. Except for one. The driver of my SUV, The hulking silhouette who had told me to be quiet walked back into the mill. He didn't look at the helicopter. He walked straight toward me, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel and sawdust. He stopped a few feet away and held out his hand. I stared at it. I realized I was shivering violently, my teeth chattering so hard they ached. I reached up my blood-crusted fingers, slipping against his leather glove. He hauled me to my feet with zero effort. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked toward the lone SUV left idling inside the mill. I followed him. My legs felt like wet paper. I climbed into the passenger seat. The interior still smelled of sweat and dirt, but now it also smelled of the blood that was drying on my hands and jeans. The driver threw the vehicle into gear, and we pulled out of the mill just as the pitch of the helicopter rotors changed, whining into a heavy, ascending beat. By the time we hit the logging road, the sound was gone, swallowed entirely by the coastal forest. The drive back was agonizingly silent. I stared out the window at the passing trees, watching the thick gray pre-dawn light slowly begin to filter through the canopy. My mind was a skipping record. I kept replaying the feeling of the slippery artery, the hot spray of blood on my face, the flat, unblinking eyes of the lead operator. It felt like a hallucination, a violent, vivid fever dream. But my hands were sticky. The blood under my fingernails was real. We hit the paved road of Highway 101. The driver navigated the curves with smooth, practiced precision. He never looked at me. He never turned on the radio. 15 minutes later, we pulled into the rear parking lot of St. Jude's. The lot was exactly as I had left it. The single sodium lamp was still buzzing. My crappy 2011 Honda was sitting there looking pathetic and small. The fog was lifting, revealing the drab, peeling exterior of the hospital. The SUV came to a smooth halt right next to my car. I sat there for a moment, my hand hovering over the door handle. I felt like I should say something. Good luck, or I hope he lives, or even just, what the hell was that? But the heavy, suffocating silence of the operator beside me killed the words in my throat. I realized they didn't want my well wishes. They didn't want my curiosity. They wanted me to be exactly what I was, a ghost who had briefly intersected with their shadow world and who was now stepping back into the light. I pushed the heavy door open and climbed out. My boots hit the wet asphalt. I closed the door. I didn't slam it. Before I even turned around, the SUV was moving. It didn't speed away. It just rolled smoothly down the alleyway, turning right onto the main street and blending effortlessly into the early morning commuter traffic. A dark shape disappearing into the gray. I stood alone in the parking lot. The damp coastal wind bit through my thin t-shirt. I had left my hoodie in the dirt at the mill. I walked over to my Honda, my reflection catching in the cracked side mirror. I looked terrible. There was a smear of dried brown blood across my cheek and jawline. My eyes were hollow, ringed with exhausted purple shadows. My hair was plastered to my forehead with sweat. I fumbled in my pockets, my bloody fingers brushing against something hard. My keys. The operator had picked them up when I dropped them in the parking lot. I pulled them out, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The car smelled like stale coffee and old upholstery. It was the most beautiful, comforting smell in the world. I rested my forehead against the cold, hard plastic of the steering wheel. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the sound of my own breathing. Then I saw it. Sitting on the passenger seat was the single bent cigarette I had dropped 3 hours ago. Next to it was a cheap plastic gas station lighter. I picked them up. I put the bent cigarette between my lips, sparked the lighter, and took a long, deep drag. The harsh smoke burned the back of my throat, but it felt incredibly grounding. It felt real. I looked at the hospital building. Through the ground floor windows, I could see the morning shift arriving, carrying their thermoses, complaining about the rain, ready to face the mundane tragedies of the day. 12 years of nursing. 12 years of feeling like I was just moving meat around a conveyor belt waiting for a shift to end. I had quit tonight. I had walked out absolutely certain I had nothing left to give to this profession. I took another drag of the cigarette, blowing the smoke out into the cold cabin of the car. I looked down at my hands at the dark dried blood flaking off my skin. I had saved a man's life in the dirt. I had held the line between breathing and nothingness with my bare hands. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, choked, and finally caught settling into its familiar, uneven idle. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the coast highway. I didn't know what I was going to do tomorrow. I didn't know if I would ever wash the smell of cordite and blood out of my memory. But as I drove into the pale morning light, one thing was entirely clear. I was a nurse. I always would be. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, do me a massive favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on more gritty grounded storytelling. Share this video with someone who appreciates real raw drama. Leave a comment down below with your favorite moment or what you'd do in her shoes. Thanks for watching and stay safe.